"Pour the wine, servant girl," she said without looking at me, "and do try not to spill."
The crystal decanter was heavy in my hands. The wine inside was a deep, blood-dark burgundy, the same shade as the gown Lady Isadora wore as she sat at the head of my table, in my chair, wearing my jewels. "Pour the wine, servant girl," she said without looking at me. Her voice was sweet, dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that only the truly powerful dare to use. "And do try not to spill. This is French, not the swill you people are accustomed to." I did not tremble, I did not flinch. I poured the wine with a steady hand, the same hand that had once signed the deed to this estate, the same hand that wore the Duchess's ring they believed was buried 6 feet underground with my corpse. They thought I was dead. Every single person at that table, my husband, his scheming sister, the lawyer, the physician who had signed the death certificate, they all believed I was rotting in the Ashworth family crypt. But the dead have a way of returning when you least expect them. And tonight, at this glittering banquet thrown to celebrate the anniversary of my murder, I was going to rise. But to understand how I ended up pouring wine at my own funeral feast, we must go back. Back to the cold, gray morning when I first arrived at Ashworth Hall. A bride full of hope, stepping into a house that would try to devour me. I was not born to be a duchess. I was born in a small stone vicarage on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, the eldest daughter of Reverend Edmund Thorne, a man of great intellect and absolutely no fortune. My mother had died bringing my younger brother James into the world, and so at the age of 7, I became the woman of the house. I learned to mend, to manage, to make 1 shilling do the work of 5. I learned to be silent when silence was needed and steady when the world shook. My beauty, if I had any, was of the quiet sort. I had my mother's dark hair, deep as ink, and her green eyes the color of moss after rain. I had her long, careful hands, but I did not have her laughter. Life had taken that from me early. I was 22 when I met Lord Alexander Ashworth, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, and my world changed in a single afternoon. He came to our village on a hunting trip, and a sudden downpour drove him to seek shelter at the vicarage. I remember opening the door and finding him there, drenched, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his gray eyes startled and almost boyish. He was tall, impossibly so, and carried himself with the unconscious authority of a man who had never been denied anything. But there was something else in his face. A weariness, a sadness that he wore like an old coat, barely noticed but always present. My father invited him in. We had little to offer, thin soup and coarse bread, but we offered it freely. Alexander, as I would come to call him, sat at our rough kitchen table, and for 3 hours he talked. Not about himself, but about everything else. He asked me about the books on our shelves. He listened when I spoke of the moors, of the way the heather turned purple in late summer, of the silence that could be either a prison or a prayer. He looked at me as if I were the first real person he had encountered in years. And I, God help me, I looked at him as if he were the sun breaking through a lifetime of gray sky. He returned the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. The hunting trip was forgotten. His companions grew restless and left. He stayed. On the 7th day, he asked my father for my hand. My father, who had expected me to marry a curate or a schoolmaster if I married at all, was stunned. I was stunned, a duke, asking for the hand of a vicar's daughter with no dowry, no connections, no fortune. Why? I asked him. We were standing in the garden, the last of the autumn roses clinging to the wall behind him. Why me? You could have anyone. He took my hand. His fingers were warm and rough, not the soft hands of an idle nobleman. Because, he said, his gray eyes holding mine with an intensity that stole my breath, you are the only person who has ever spoken to me as if my title did not exist. You see me, not the Duke, me. I believed him. I should not have. No, that is not fair. He meant it, every word. The tragedy of Alexander Ashworth was not that he was dishonest, it was that he was weak. And weakness, in a house like Ashworth Hall, was the most dangerous quality of all. We were married 6 weeks later in the small parish church where my father preached. I wore a dress of ivory cotton that I had sewn myself. It was not silk, it was not satin, but when Alexander saw me walk down the aisle, his eyes glistened, and I thought, this is enough. This is more than enough. Ashworth Hall was a world away from everything I had ever known. It rose from the Northumberland landscape like a dark crown, all turrets and towers and ancient stone blackened by centuries of wind and rain. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. It had 47 rooms, a staff of 60, and a history so long it was woven into the very walls. I arrived as its new mistress with one trunk of clothes and no illusions about the task ahead. The staff regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disdain. I was not what they had expected. I was not grand, I was not glamorous. I was a vicar's daughter in a mended gray traveling dress stepping into a world of crystal chandeliers and ancestral portraits. I could feel their judgment like a cold draft. But I did what I had always done. I worked, I learned the name of every servant, from the housekeeper, the formidable Mrs. Blackwood, to the youngest scullery maid, a girl named Nell who was barely 12. I learned the rhythms of the house, the schedule of the fires, the rotation of the linens, the precise amount of beeswax needed for the ballroom floor. I inspected the kitchens, the still room, the accounts. The accounts were what surprised me most. Ashworth was wealthy, enormously so, but the wealth was badly managed. There were discrepancies, expenditures that made no sense, sums paid out to creditors for debts that seemed to appear and vanish like ghosts. I said nothing, not yet. I filed the information away and continued learning. Alexander was kind to me. In private, he was warm, even tender. He would read to me by the fire, his deep voice rapping around the words. He would walk with me in the gardens, pointing out the plants his mother had loved. He would hold my hand at dinner, a small, secret gesture beneath the table. But in public, he was a different man. The warmth vanished. The authority returned. He deferred to his sister, Lady Isadora, with a meekness that puzzled me. Isadora, even now, writing her name sends a chill through my bones. Lady Isadora Ashworth was Alexander's elder sister by 3 years. She had never married, a fact that society whispered about but never dared to address to her face. She was handsome rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and the same gray Ashworth eyes, but hers held no warmth. They were the gray of a winter sky, flat and pitiless. She had ruled Ashworth Hall since her mother's death, and she ruled it absolutely. The servants feared her, the tenants avoided her, even the estate manager, a seasoned man named Hartley, lowered his gaze when she entered a room. She was the true power of the house, and everyone knew it, including Alexander. From the moment I arrived, Isadora regarded me as an enemy. She did not say so, not at first. She was far too clever for that. Her weapons were subtler, more insidious. A barbed comment disguised as a compliment, a correction offered with a smile, a meal rearranged without my knowledge, a gown she deemed unsuitable for a duchess, returned to my wardrobe with the seams altered so it no longer fit. Small cuts, each one carefully placed. "You must not mind, Isadora," Alexander said one evening when I mentioned that the dinner menu had been changed for the 3rd time that week without my input. "She has managed the house for years. It is simply her way. She means no harm." I looked at my husband. This tall, handsome man who could command a room of hundreds but could not say no to his own sister, and I felt the first cold thread of understanding wind through my chest. He was afraid of her. I was not. Not then. I should have been. I did not challenge Isadora directly. I had learned long ago that a frontal assault against a fortified position was foolish. Instead, I simply continued to be present. I continued to learn the house, to earn the quiet respect of the staff, to demonstrate through daily, steady action that I was the Duchess and I was here to stay. Mrs. Blackwood was the first to come to my side. She appeared at my sitting room one morning, her eyes red-rimmed but her back ramrod straight. "Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are things you should know." She told me about the accounts, the sums that vanished, the payments to a man named Silas Ketch, a solicitor in Newcastle, for services rendered. She told me about the letters Isadora received, sealed with black wax, always burned immediately after reading. She told me about the night 3 years ago when the previous housekeeper had been dismissed without reference for asking too many questions. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Mrs. Blackwood met my eyes. "Because you are the first mistress of this house who has ever asked for my name." That night I lay awake beside my sleeping husband, staring at the canopy above our bed, and I understood the shape of the cage I had walked into. Isadora was not merely a difficult sister-in-law. She was a predator, and I, the vicar's daughter with no allies and no fortune, was standing between her and something she wanted desperately to protect. I did not yet know what it was, but I knew I was running out of time to find out. The headaches started in February. At first, I thought nothing of it. The Northumberland winter was brutal, and I was not accustomed to the damp, bone-deep cold of Ashworth Hall. A headache was a small thing. I took a tisane and carried on, but the headaches grew worse. They came with a heaviness in my limbs, a strange metallic taste in my mouth, a fog that settled over my thoughts and would not lift. By March, I was struggling to rise before noon. By April, I could barely keep food down. The physician, Dr. Merriweather, was summoned. He was a portly, florid man with small, anxious eyes. He examined me and pronounced his diagnosis with the solemnity of a man reading a death sentence. A constitutional weakness, Your Grace, common in young women of delicate disposition. I recommend rest, light broths, and a tonic. He produced a small brown bottle. The tonic. It tasted of bitter herbs and something else I could not name, something sharp and faintly sweet. Drink it twice daily, he instructed. It will restore your strength. I drank it obediently. I trusted the physician. I trusted the routine of care that surrounded me. The broths brought by the kitchen. The tonic measured out by Isadora herself, who had taken over the management of my sick room with an efficiency that was almost maternal. Poor dear, she would say, smoothing my pillow with her cool, dry hands. You must rest. You must not worry about the house. I will manage everything. And she did. As I grew weaker, Isadora grew stronger. She reclaimed the household accounts. She dismissed a footman who had been loyal to me. She intercepted my correspondence, explaining with a gentle smile that she did not want me troubled by tedious letters. The world was shrinking. My world, which had briefly expanded to encompass a 47-room hall and acres of wild Northumberland landscape, was closing in around me, reducing itself to the four walls of my bedroom, the view from my window, the bitter taste of the tonic on my tongue. Alexander came to see me every day. He sat by my bed, his face drawn and worried, holding my hand. You will be well, he said again and again, as if repetition could make it true. The doctor says you will be well, but I was not getting well. I was dying, slowly, methodically, unmistakably dying. And somewhere in the fog of my poisoned mind, a small, stubborn voice began to whisper, "Something is wrong. Something is very, very wrong." It was Nell who saved me. Little Nell, the scullery maid, barely 12 years old, with hands chapped red from washing and eyes too old for her thin face. She came to my room one night in late April, long after the house had fallen silent. I was drifting in and out of a fitful sleep, the kind that brings no rest, only strange, distorted dreams. I heard the door creak and forced my eyes open. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice trembling. She was clutching something to her chest. "Your Grace, please. I need to show you something." I tried to sit up. The room swam. "What is it, Nell?" She crept to the bedside and opened her hand. In her palm lay a small twist of paper, inside it a fine white powder that caught the candlelight like crushed glass. "I found it in Lady Isadora's private cabinet," Nell said, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of terror. "She keeps a locked box in her dressing room. I was cleaning the grate and the key was left in the drawer. I know I should not have looked, Your Grace. I know. But I have watched you getting sicker and sicker, and the way she smiles when she brings your tonic, and I thought. She could not finish. Tears were streaming down her face. I stared at the white powder. My foggy mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, but deep in my gut, in that ancient animal place where instinct lives, I already knew. "What is it?" I asked, though I feared the answer. "I do not know, Your Grace, but there is a whole jar of it, and it looks exactly like what she stirs into your tonic every morning." The room went very still. The candle flickered. And in that moment, the fog in my mind did not lift, it shattered. Like a pane of glass struck by a stone, it broke into 1,000 pieces, and through the cracks poured a cold, blinding clarity. She was poisoning me. Isadora was poisoning me. The tonic, the broths, the tender care, the smoothing of my pillow. It was all a performance, a slow, meticulous murder dressed in the costume of compassion. I looked at Nell, this brave, terrified child who had risked everything to bring me this truth, and I made a decision that would change the course of my life. "Tell no one," I said, my voice barely a breath. "Not a soul. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide. "And Nell, from tonight, I need you to do something for me. When Isadora brings my tonic, I will pretend to drink it, but I need you to bring me clean water instead, hidden in the chamber pot cover. Can you do that?" She swallowed hard and nodded again. "Yes, Your Grace." "Good girl. Now go. Quickly, before anyone sees you." She slipped away like a ghost. I lay back against my pillows, my heart hammering, my poisoned body trembling with a mixture of terror and something I had not felt in months. Rage. Pure, white-hot, crystalline rage. From that night forward, I stopped taking the tonic. I poured it into the chamber pot when Isadora left the room, replacing it with Nell's clean water. I pretended to sip the broths but ate only the bread, which I judged to be safe. It was not much. I was already desperately weak. But slowly, painfully, the fog began to lift. It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of pretending to grow sicker while secretly clawing my way back from the edge of death. 2 weeks of lying in that bed, listening to Isadora's honeyed voice, feeling her cool hands adjust my blankets, watching her measure out the poison with the precision of an apothecary, and saying nothing. Nothing. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than the poverty of my childhood. Harder than the loneliness of my marriage. Lying there, looking into the face of my would-be murderer, and smiling weakly as she told me to rest. But I needed time. I needed to think. I needed a plan, and I needed to understand why. Why was she doing this? What did she gain from my death? The answer came from Mrs. Blackwood, who visited me one afternoon while Isadora was in town. "The entail, Your Grace," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice low. "If the Duke dies without a male heir, the estate passes to the nearest male Ashworth. That would be Sir Reginald Ashworth, a distant cousin in London. But if the Duke's wife were to die, and the Duke were to remarry, someone of Isadora's choosing, someone she could control," she trailed off, but I understood. Isadora did not want the estate for herself. A woman could not inherit under the entail. She wanted to control who stood beside Alexander. She wanted a puppet duchess, a weak, malleable bride who would let Isadora continue to rule. And I, the vicar's daughter who had dared to inspect the accounts, who had dared to learn the servants' names, who had dared to be competent, I was the obstacle. I had to be removed. My plan was born in pieces, assembled in the dark hours of the night when the house slept and only the wind kept me company. I could not simply accuse Isadora. I had no proof that would hold in a court of law. The powder Nell had found could be explained away. Dr. Merriweather was clearly in Isadora's pocket. He had been signing the prescriptions, providing the tonic. If I accused her, it would be the word of a sick, confused young woman against the word of an established noblewoman and a respected physician. I would be declared hysterical. Or worse, mad. No, I needed to disappear. I needed them to believe they had won. And then I needed to return, not as a victim, but as a force they could not deny. I wrote 2 letters. The first was to my brother, James, now 18 and studying law in Edinburgh. I told him everything. The poisoning, the accounts, the conspiracy. I told him to speak to no one, to trust no one, but to begin quietly gathering evidence. I sealed it and gave it to Nell, who posted it herself from the village. The second letter I hid beneath a loose floorboard in my dressing room, along with the twist of powder Nell had found and a lock of my hair. Insurance in case everything went wrong. Then I began to die. I let my decline accelerate. I stopped eating almost entirely. I let the pallor deepen, the hollows beneath my eyes grow dark. I moaned in my sleep. I called out for my mother, who had been dead for 16 years. I gave them the performance of a lifetime. Alexander was distraught. He spent hours at my bedside, his face a mask of grief. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him the truth, to beg him to open his eyes and see what his sister was doing, but I could not trust him. Not because he was evil, but because he was weak. If I told him, he would confront Isadora, and Isadora would simply change her method. The next time, I might not have a Nell to save me. So I let my husband grieve for a wife who was not yet dead. On the night of May the 14th, I staged my own death. Nell and Mrs. Blackwood were my only conspirators. Mrs. Blackwood procured a sleeping draught, the real kind, from an apothecary in a neighboring village, one that would slow my heartbeat and breathing to the barest whisper. I took it at midnight. When Isadora came to check on me at dawn, she found what she had been waiting for, a still, cold body. No pulse she could detect, no breath to fog the mirror she held to my lips. I know what happened next only from what Nell and Mrs. Blackwood later told me. Isadora did not cry. She stood beside my bed for a full minute, looking down at me, and then she straightened the collar of my nightgown with one precise, practiced movement. She walked to the door, opened it, and said in a voice of perfect composure, "Send for the doctor. The Duchess is dead." Alexander's scream echoed through the house. Nell, who was hiding in the servants' corridor, told me she heard it from 3 floors away. It was the sound of a man whose soul had cracked open. He came running, stumbling, and threw himself across my body, weeping, calling my name. And I, drugged and paralyzed, felt his tears fall on my face and could not move, could not speak, could not tell him I was still alive. That was the moment I truly understood what Isadora had cost me. Not just my health, not just my safety, but the trust between my husband and me. She had turned our love into a wound. Dr. Merriweather arrived and declared me dead. The death certificate was signed, the cause a long and wasting illness. No one questioned it, no one demanded an examination. A young duchess with a fragile constitution taken too soon. It was a tragedy, but not a surprise. The funeral was arranged for 3 days hence. My body was placed in a closed coffin, which was a mercy because by midnight I had begun to stir. Mrs. Blackwood came to me in the dead of night. She and Nell carried me, weak and half-conscious, through the servants' passages and out through the kitchen garden to a waiting cart. I was wrapped in rough blankets and driven 5 miles through the darkness to a cottage on the far edge of the Ashworth estate, a tumble-down place used by the shepherds in lambing season. There, in a cold room that smelled of lanolin and damp straw, I opened my eyes and took my first free breath in months. I was dead and I had never felt more alive. Recovery was slow and brutal. For 3 weeks I lay in the shepherd's cottage, tended by Nell and Mrs. Blackwood, who came in secret, always after dark. My body, weakened by months of poison, fought to rebuild itself. I ate plain food, oats, milk, eggs from a neighboring farm. I drank clean water. I slept without fear for the first time since February, and I thought with a clarity that was almost painful, as if the poison had been clouding, not just my body but my mind, and now that it was gone, every thought was sharp as a blade. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back, not as the Duchess. The Duchess was dead. I had to go back as no one, as a ghost, as a shadow. I had to see with my own eyes what Isadora had built on the grave of my memory. On the 4th week, when I could walk without trembling, I cut my hair. It had been long past my waist, the deep ink black that Alexander had loved to run his fingers through. I cut it to my shoulders and tied it back severely under a plain white cap. I rubbed ash into my skin to dull its color. I dressed in the coarse brown wool of a working woman, a dress Mrs. Blackwood had procured from a village market 3 towns away. I looked in the small, spotted mirror above the cottage washstand and did not recognize myself. Good. Mrs. Blackwood arranged everything. A new servant was needed at Ashworth Hall, a kitchen maid to replace the one who had recently left. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood herself, would handle the hiring. No one would question it. I arrived at the servants' entrance of Ashworth Hall on a gray June morning, 3 weeks after my own funeral. I carried a small bundle of clothes and a reference letter written by Mrs. Blackwood in a disguised hand. My name, the name I gave, was Mary. Just Mary. A nobody. A girl from nowhere. The kitchen was exactly as I remembered it. The great iron range, the copper pots, the long scrubbed table where the servants took their meals. But everything felt different now. I was seeing it from below, from the other side. As a duchess, I had walked through this kitchen with authority. As Mary, I entered it with my head bowed. You are the new girl? The cook, Mrs. Finnegan, looked me up and down with a critical eye. You are thin. Can you carry a full coal scuttle? Yes, ma'am. Can you scrub a floor without being told twice? Yes, ma'am. Can you keep your mouth shut and your eyes down? I met her gaze for a fraction of a second, then dropped it. Yes, ma'am. Good. You start now. The silver needs polishing for tonight. Lady Isadora is expecting guests. Lady Isadora, not the Duchess, not Alexander's wife. Lady Isadora. The transformation was complete. In the 3 weeks since my death, Isadora had reclaimed her throne. She had moved into the Duchess's apartments. She wore the Ashworth jewels. She sat at the head of the table. She received guests. She managed the accounts. She was in all but name the mistress of Ashworth Hall. And Alexander, my Alexander, was a ghost in his own house. I saw him on my 2nd day. He walked through the kitchen corridor without seeing anyone, his eyes unfocused, his clothes slightly rumpled. He had lost weight. His face was gaunt, the sharp angles even sharper. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. I pressed myself against the wall as he passed, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain he would hear it. He walked within 2 feet of me. His sleeve brushed my arm. He did not look at me. He did not see me, of course he did not. He was looking for a dead woman, and the dead woman was standing right in front of him, holding a bucket of dirty water. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him and say, "It is me, I am here, I am alive, open your eyes," but I did not. I could not yet. Because Isadora was watching, she was always watching, and I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went before I struck. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. I spent 4 weeks as Mary, 4 weeks of scrubbing floors, polishing silver, carrying coal, and watching, always watching. I learned things that made my blood run cold. Isadora had wasted no time. Within a week of my funeral, she had contacted a matchmaker in London. She was already searching for Alexander's next bride, a young woman from a minor noble family, a girl of 17 with a gentle disposition and no mind of her own. The perfect puppet, the perfect replacement. I learned that Dr. Merriweather visited Isadora privately every Tuesday. He came through the side entrance and left through the garden. He was not treating a patient. He was receiving payment. I saw the envelope of banknotes she pressed into his hands through the crack in the pantry door. I learned that the solicitor, Silas Ketch, had been forging documents. Mrs. Blackwood had obtained copies. There were papers transferring portions of the Ashworth estate into a private trust controlled by Isadora. Not in her name, of course. She was too clever for that. In the name of a shell company registered in the Channel Islands, she had been siphoning the estate's wealth for years, slowly, carefully, like a surgeon removing organs one at a time. And I learned about the banquet. It was to be held on the 14th of July, exactly 2 months to the day after my death, a grand affair. 50 guests, the finest food and wine. A celebration, Isadora told the staff, of the Ashworth legacy. A chance to show the county that the estate was thriving under her stewardship. But I knew what it truly was. It was a coronation, her coronation. The night she would present the new bride to society and cement her control over Ashworth Hall forever. I would not let that happen. My brother James had been busy in Edinburgh. His letters, smuggled to me through Nell, brought news of gathering evidence. He had found a chemist willing to analyze the powder. Arsenic, slow-acting, cumulative, undetectable in the amounts Isadora had been using. He had found witnesses. A former servant dismissed by Isadora 3 years ago, a clerk at Silas Ketch's office, who was willing to testify about the forged documents. He had consulted a barrister. The case was building, but evidence in a courtroom was not enough. I needed something more. I needed a moment, a single devastating moment of truth that could not be denied, could not be explained away, could not be buried. I needed the banquet. July 4 arrived with a sky the color of bruised plums. Thunder grumbled in the distance, but the rain held off. Ashworth Hall blazed with light, every window a golden rectangle against the dark stone. The chandeliers had been lit for the first time since my wedding. The silver gleamed. The crystal sang. I worked in the kitchen all day helping prepare the feast. Roasted pheasant, glazed ham, syllabubs and trifles, towers of fruit and cheese. Wine had been brought up from the cellars, the finest bottles, some older than the house itself. I dressed in my servant's uniform, a plain black dress with a white apron and cap. I looked at myself in the scullery mirror. My face was thinner than it had been, harder. My green eyes, once soft and uncertain, now held a steady, burning light. I was ready. The guests arrived in a procession of carriages. I stood in the shadows of the entrance hall, holding a tray of sherry glasses. Invisible. I watched them flow past, lords and ladies, magistrates and military men, the great and good of Northumberland society. They all deferred to Isadora, who stood at the entrance in a gown of deep blood red, the Ashworth rubies blazing at her throat. My rubies. My throat. Alexander stood beside her, a tall, dark shadow. He was wearing black, still in mourning, and his face was the face of a man attending his own execution. He shook hands. He nodded. He said nothing. I moved through the crowd, offering drinks, collecting empty glasses, a servant, a piece of furniture, utterly beneath notice. I passed within inches of people who had sat at my dinner table, who had kissed my hand, who had called me Your Grace. Not one of them recognized me. Invisibility, I realized, was the most powerful disguise of all. It was not about changing your face. It was about changing your status. A duchess is seen. A servant is not. The same eyes, the same hands, the same woman, but wrapped in a different cloth, and the world looks right through you. Dinner was served at 8. 50 guests were seated around the great table in the dining hall, beneath the portraits of 7 generations of Ashworth dukes. My portrait, painted just 6 months ago, had been removed. A landscape hung in its place, as if I had never existed. Isadora sat at the head of the table, Alexander to her right. To her left sat a young woman I had not seen before, a pale, pretty thing with wide, frightened eyes and a dress too expensive for her small frame. The new bride, the replacement. I was assigned to serve the wine. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. I moved along the table with the heavy crystal decanter, filling glasses with the slow, deliberate care of a well-trained servant. I reached Isadora. She did not look up. "Pour the wine, servant girl," she said, her voice carrying the lazy authority of a woman who had never doubted her right to command. "And do try not to spill. This is French, not the swill you people are accustomed to." I poured the wine. My hand did not tremble. The burgundy fell into the crystal glass in a perfect, dark stream. "Yes, my lady," I said quietly, and then I moved on. I poured for the young bride, whose hand shook as she lifted her glass. I poured for the magistrate, for the colonel, for the vicar's wife. I circled the entire table. 60 glasses filled, the ritual of service performed with an almost sacred precision. When the last glass was full, I set the decanter down on the sideboard. Then I turned to face the table. "I would like to propose a toast," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried. It had the clarity of a bell struck in a silent church. 50 heads turned. 50 pairs of eyes found the servant girl who had dared to speak. Isadora's face twisted with irritation. What on earth? Remove this girl immediately, but I did not move. I stood at the foot of the great table, beneath the empty space where my portrait had hung, and I reached up and pulled the white cap from my head. My dark hair, shorter than it had been but unmistakable, fell around my face. "To the Duchess of Ashworth," I said, my voice rising. "Who is not as dead as some might wish?" The silence that followed was a living thing. It swallowed the room. It devoured the sound of cutlery and crystal and polite conversation, and left nothing but a void, a vast, ringing emptiness in which 50 people held their breath. Alexander was the first to move. He rose from his chair, his face drained of all color, his gray eyes wide with something beyond shock, beyond disbelief. It was the face of a man watching a miracle or a ghost. "Eleanor," he whispered. My true name, my given name, the name he had spoken in the dark, the name he had murmured against my hair. "Eleanor." "Hello, Alexander," I said, and my voice, though steady, cracked on his name. Isadora recovered first. She always did. Her mind was quicker than a viper's strike. "This is preposterous," she said, rising from her chair, her voice sharp as broken glass. "This is clearly a deranged servant girl, a madwoman. Someone call the constable." "I would advise against that," said a voice from the doorway. Every head turned. Standing at the entrance to the dining hall was my brother, James. He was no longer the gangly boy I had sent away to Edinburgh. He was a young man in a lawyer's coat, and behind him stood 2 men I did not recognize. One wore the sober black of a king's counsel. The other wore the uniform of a county magistrate. "My name is James Thorne," my brother said, his voice steady. "I am the brother of Eleanor Thorne Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth. I am also her legal representative. And I am here to present evidence of attempted murder, fraud, and the systematic theft of the Ashworth estate." He walked into the room and placed a leather case on the table. From it, he drew a stack of documents one by one, laying them out like cards in a game he had already won. A chemical analysis of arsenic powder found in Lady Isadora's private cabinet, matching the compound present in the tonic prescribed to the Duchess. He laid down the first document. Sworn testimony from a former servant, dismissed by Lady Isadora, attesting to the disappearance of household funds over a period of 4 years. The second document. Forged documents in the hand of Silas Ketch, solicitor, transferring Ashworth properties to a shell trust controlled by Lady Isadora Ashworth. The third, a signed confession from Dr. Henry Merriweather, obtained yesterday, admitting to his role in falsifying the Duchess's diagnosis and providing the arsenic compound in exchange for payment. The fourth, each document landed on the table like a hammer blow. The room was utterly silent. The guests stared. The servants stared. The candles flickered in a draught from the open door. Isadora stood frozen. The color had drained from her face, leaving it the gray-white of old bone. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles sharp beneath the skin. "This is lies," she said, but her voice had lost its command. It was thin now, reedy, the voice of a woman whose foundations were crumbling beneath her. "This is a conspiracy. Alexander, tell them this is madness." Every eye turned to Alexander. My husband stood at the table, his hands flat on the polished wood, his head bowed. He was not looking at the documents. He was not looking at his sister. He was looking at me. His gray eyes, those stormy, beautiful, weak eyes, were filled with tears. "I knew," he said. The room gasped. "I knew something was wrong. I knew you were getting sicker. I knew the tonic did not help. I knew and I did nothing." His voice broke. "I was too afraid of her, too afraid to see the truth. I let my cowardice, I let my silence." He could not finish. He pressed his hands to his face and wept. I looked at him. This man I had loved, this man I still loved despite everything, and I felt the anger that had sustained me for months shift and change. It did not disappear. Anger like mine does not disappear, but it made room for something else. Something I had thought Isadora had killed along with the woman I used to be. Compassion. I walked to him. The room parted before me like water. I stood beside him and placed my hand on his arm. He flinched at my touch as if he expected me to strike him. "Look at me," I said softly. He raised his eyes. "I am alive," I said. "I am here, and we have a great deal of work to do." The magistrate stepped forward. "Lady Isadora Ashworth," he said, "I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of attempted murder, fraud, and embezzlement." Isadora did not scream. She did not protest. She looked at me, and in her flat gray eyes I saw something I had never seen before. Not fear, not remorse, recognition. She saw me, truly saw me, for the first time. Not the vicar's daughter, not the mouse in gray, but the woman who had outplayed her at her own game. "You clever little wretch," she whispered. "Yes," I said. "I am." They led her away. The dining hall erupted into chaos. Guests rose from their seats. Voices clashed. Questions flew. But I heard none of it. I was looking at my husband and he was looking at me, and for the first time in our marriage there were no walls between us. He reached for my hand. His fingers were trembling. "Can you ever forgive me?" he asked. I thought of the poison. I thought of the fog. I thought of the cold bed in the shepherd's cottage and the sound of his scream echoing through the house when he thought I had died. "Forgiveness," I said, "is not a single act. It is a garden. It must be tended. It takes time." He closed his eyes. A tear slid down his cheek. "Then I will tend it," he said. "For the rest of my life, I will tend it." I squeezed his hand. It was not absolution, but it was a beginning. The autumn of 1822 came to Ashworth Hall, not as a creditor, but as a guest. The trees in the park had turned to gold and copper. The chimneys breathed thick, confident plumes of smoke. The windows gleamed. The stone, washed clean by a summer of repairs, was lighter than it had been in decades. The house was no longer holding its breath. It was breathing deeply, freely for the first time in years. I stood at the window of my sitting room, the room that had once been Isadora's, and watched the morning light fall across the moors. In my arms, wrapped in a blanket of the softest white wool, slept my daughter. She had her father's dark hair and my green eyes, and she was, I thought with a fierce, protective love, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We named her Hope. Isadora's trial had been swift and merciless. The evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Merriweather, faced with the full weight of the law, had confessed everything. Silas Ketch had followed. Isadora herself had said nothing throughout the proceedings. Sitting in the dock with the rigid composure of a statue, she was convicted and sentenced to transportation. The last I heard, she was on a ship bound for the colonies. I did not feel triumph. I felt something quieter and more lasting than that. I felt peace. Alexander and I had rebuilt our marriage, slowly, carefully, like restoring a damaged painting stroke by stroke. He had resigned from public life. He spent his days on the estate, working alongside his tenants, repairing fences, planting crops, learning the land he had inherited but never truly known. His hands, which had once been idle, were now calloused and strong. He was not the same man I had married. The weakness was still there, threaded through him like a flaw in a gemstone, but he no longer hid from it. He faced it daily, with a quiet determination that I found more admirable than any grand gesture. Mrs. Blackwood remained as housekeeper, her loyalty rewarded with a generous pension and a cottage of her own for her retirement. Nell, my brave, fierce Nell, was no longer a scullery maid. I had personally arranged for her education. She was learning to read and write, and she had a sharp, hungry mind that devoured books the way fire devours kindling. She would go far, I would make sure of it. My brother James had returned to Edinburgh to complete his legal studies. He wrote to me every week, long, detailed letters full of ambition and affection. He would be a great lawyer one day. He already was. The young bride Isadora had selected. The pale girl with the frightened eyes had been quietly returned to her family with a generous settlement and a sincere apology from Alexander. I heard she had married a kind clergyman the following spring and was very happy. I looked down at Hope, sleeping in my arms, her tiny fist curled around my finger. She did not know the story of how she came to be. She did not know about the poison, the coffin, the servant's dress, the night her mother rose from the dead. One day, perhaps, I would tell her, but not today. Today the sun was shining. The moors were golden. My husband was somewhere in the south field, probably arguing with the sheep. My daughter was warm and safe in my arms, and I, Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, the woman they had poisoned, buried, and forgotten, was standing in the sunlight, very much alive. It turns out that the dead have rather a lot to say. You just have to be brave enough to listen. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what this story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss new stories.